Morning, Kostik.
Good morning, Sri Mulyani. How are you?
How are you? Hi, Dani. Hi, Ibu Mari.
Hi, Mbak Ani.
Okay.
All right, good morning to you, Sri Mulyani.
So I'm very unfortunate not to welcome you in person. Are we starting?
I think we can start.
We can, yeah.
Okay.
Should we start?
Yeah, I think we should start.
Okay.
Go ahead, Kostik.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. You've just heard the opening addresses, but this is the opening panel. We are going to get now into something more substantial related to topics. This is, as you know, on Asian and global policy issues. Let me just say a few words before we start off that IEA plays a very, very special role and really stands out as an organization that straddles the world of ideas and science and the world of policymaking. And it also plays a very special role as an economics organization that we try to bring in countries from around the world, from small nations, poor nations, we bring people in. This time, of course, we are doing it all virtually, given the very difficult situation where we are, but that is the spirit in which we are approaching today's meeting. This is also a very, very special moment for Asia. The pandemic, as you know, it is one wave after another is coming. All the countries are reeling. At the same time, this is being viewed by many as a time of hope, time when you can turn policies around and look towards the future. It is in that spirit that we are today bringing together in front of you some of the best minds from the world of research and from the world of policy. We really wanted to bring people who straddle both these. There are three speakers. We will first have Her Excellency Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Professor Danny Roderick, Dr. Mari Panyestu. I'm going to introduce each of these speakers in that order separately as we bring them in. So let me plunge right in. A couple of rules of how we will do this. We are running a bit behind time. Initially, the speakers were given 15 minutes. If you can squeeze it in a little bit, 12 minutes or so, that will still leave us a little bit of time for people in the audience who may want to ask questions. We do want to do that, but if we are running short of time, we will have to do without that. So let me introduce the first speaker today. That is the Minister of Finance of Indonesia, Sri Mulyani Indrawati. As she just said in the opening address, I worked with her very closely when we were both in the World Bank. She was managing director of the World Bank. And before that, again, she was for a period Minister of Finance of Indonesia. What Sri Mulyani may not remember is the first time I met her was before all that. It was a think tank meeting in Delhi, much before all that. Very high-powered meeting with Joe Stiglitz, Nemat Shafiq, the philosopher Rob Riemann, where Sri Mulyani had come. I had met her for the first time. It really gives me great pleasure to have her as the first speaker. Indonesia is standing at a crossroad where people are beginning to bet on the Indonesian economy despite the difficult times. It is one of the brightest sparks that is managing the very difficult management of the pandemic and also the economy. Given that there is talk of Indonesia as a possible economy that will come out strong, and she as a finance minister has played an important role, it's my pleasure to give her the floor to open today's panel discussion. Sri Mulyani.
Thank you so much, Kavik, for a very generous introduction. It's really good to see you, although I regretted that we cannot see in person. Let me share you how we respond to this very challenging time, and especially also providing a perspective where we want to go as a country. As Kavik mentioned that this is going to be a very challenging time. First, when we see this COVID hit the economy, of course, the whole economy suffer from the contraction because the COVID-19 preventing people to do the activity, and that's definitely have a strong correlation with the economic activity. So the contraction of the economy is unavoidable. So for us, then, the question is how we are going to respond with this very extraordinary situation. Not only that the economy under threat, but also the safety of the people also under threat. So the response is how the instrument like fiscal policy should be designed in a much more flexible way. For Indonesia, we then enacted an emergency law, which is then become a law, in which Indonesia, which traditionally have a very disciplined below 3% deficit fiscal deficit, and not to allow 60% of debt to GDP ratio, relaxing those cap of 3% deficit, because we suffer from the contraction on the revenue almost 20%, 19.7%. And at the same time, the spending is definitely increased because of the health reason, social safety net, support for the business, especially small and medium enterprises, but also for the corporation. So with that kind of priority, we then decided to allow the deficit to increase from 1.76% of GDP originally for 2020, widen into 6.1%. We were very flexible and responsive to the need that when the economic activity halted or stopped, that means people cannot earn income. And Indonesia, like many emerging or developing countries, we have many segments of the people activity at the informal sector. So the most important is how you are going to reach to these people. Maybe not completely, in this case, targeted, because the data as well as the system not always full in place, but we are enacted what we call it increasing social safety net up to even 50% of our population. With that, we were able to at least creating a momentum of recovery starting on the second half of the year, beginning last year. And we see also a very rapid recovery on the second half, on the second quarter of this year. But we are not complacent, Kaushik. As you all know, dealing with this COVID is like you always deal with like how to accelerate and how to brake when the situation is becoming unmanageable. As I mentioned in the opening, at this very moment, the Indonesian government have to enact the brake on the acceleration of the economic activity because of the escalation of the cases. So these are all a situation which is, I don't think that any textbook in the economics provide us with any way of lesson how to deal with this very dynamic uncertainty. But despite that, Indonesia, as I mentioned in the opening, we will accelerate the vaccination and we will continue to even use this crisis to deepen our reform. This is one of the most important lessons, Kaushik, because if you see that, use the crisis as an opportunity to reform. Although we are very overwhelmed with COVID, of course, but we also continue to discuss with the parliament how to address the issue on the investment climate and trade to be more efficient. So we have one in the lifetime of Indonesia, omnibus law, 72 law has been amended into one law to address the issue of many hurdles, obstacles, or in this case, cost of doing business which is high. That is very historical for Indonesia. With that, we do hope that Indonesia will come up stronger. Now, I'm also launching the tax reform. This is also, despite that we are still struggle with the COVID, we are not in this case, put our attention, shifting our attention that the country needs a stronger and a bolder foundation for Indonesia to continue grow in a more sustainable, equitable, and inclusive way. These are all that we are now doing. At the same time, knowing that the human capital is very critical, we also put in place two ministers, that is education and health, to reform these two very critical sectors. So with that, COVID, I would just want to share with all the audience here that when you are dealing with a crisis, and that means this is a very important opportunity to even continue and putting a place a very ambitious reform so that the country will not waste this crisis. The country will be able to even come up and building a stronger foundation. With that, the recovery as well as the reform, currently we are continue doing a very balancing act. How we are going to continue supporting the recovery, but at the same time, as a finance minister, I have to consolidate our fiscal, which is being used or being, in this case, in the position to tackle all this COVID situation quite strongly. So the deficit last year, 6.1%. This year is going to be a little bit lower at 5.7%, and we will continue in stages and measure the fiscal consolidation next year that we are currently now in discussion with the Parliament. With that, we do hope that we are going to find the right balance between supporting the recovery of the economy and maintaining a sustainability and health of our fiscal tool in the medium and long term. What does it mean? It does mean that we have to continue to improve our revenue. And that means tax reform is very, very important. How we are going to address in a more equitable the revenue across sectoral, because in Indonesia, in this case, although we are an open economy, but not a sector is actually exposed to this globalization and becoming more productive. Some of them is still very much under protection, and that's why we are going to make sure that the productivity is going to be shared. We are also lowering many of the tariff, but at the same time, we are going to have a non-tax revenue, which is aiming for how we are going to generate revenue in a more sustainable way, especially for the natural resources, considering the sustainability as well as public services. On the spending side, we really need to improve our spending, and that means whether this is related to the central government spending or local government spending, and that's why currently we also reforming central local government fiscal transfer. This is very critical for Indonesia, in which we are a big country, 34 provincial area, and more than 540 district area in Indonesia. So local government fiscal transfer is almost 1/3 of our spending, and that's why improving and creating a better coordination with the central government spending is very critical. Then we have to deal with the increasing debt. Although Indonesia at the very before COVID is still at the 38% of GDP, debt to GDP, but now because of this COVID, it will increase to around 44 to 45%. This also requires a good as well as prudent management, considering the global environment, as I mentioned in the opening, that the monetary policy as well as inflation in the United States definitely will have a spillover for many emerging countries. So with that, we try to make sure that Indonesia is going to use this opportunity to reform and also improving the quality of spending, especially because now we are using many of the digital technology to conduct many of our business or our work. And that's definitely need to be captured in the way we are going to design our spending policy. So Kaushik, I would like to just close by saying that this is a very important time. It's challenging, extraordinary, but we should not shifting our focus into what is really matter for the people, especially when we are trying and striving to create prosperity for all in a more inclusive way. So in this very particular moment, I think a very important principle of economics, good technocratic policy is even more needed. But we also know that we work in a non-vacuum political environment, whether we are talking at the global level as well as the national level. At the national level, I'm fortunate to have a good political environment in which the parliament and the government working together to define what is really needed and to push the reform even further. At the global level, I think geopolitical is going to be more complicated. And these are the area that I would like to hear more from the IEA in terms of what is going to be the globalization, as you mentioned on the opening, where the direction that we can address what is lacking before, especially in the element of equality and inclusiveness. How the global system, the trade system can be actually combined with the ability to create an affirmative policy that is going to be making sure that this policy will be equitable and enjoyed by a majority of the people, whether this is within country as well as globally. I think that's what I would like to share with you all. Just one last sentence in this case, that at the G20, because Indonesia is going to become a president of G20, we also push this reform as well as the policy issue that can create more equitable prosperity for all. That's including global taxation and digital taxation, because these are all the area which is going to be continue important. But at the same time, many countries still struggle and grapple with how you are going to establish a just and fair taxation across country. So with that, I would like to again close by saying that a challenging task, challenging time, but I'm very optimistic, especially with all good minds and thinking that is going to contribute during this meeting and Congress, will also help many policymakers to continue improving and shaping their policy. Thank you, Kosei.
Thank you very much, Sri Mulyani. In fact, these are some of the issues, the global part of it, which is very close to IEA's concerns. And we hope that the World Congress will actually be a basis of future engagement of IEA with Indonesia in many different ways. Your talk, we have got lots of listeners, and clearly you have provoked, because there are questions beginning to come in. We won't take the questions right now. We'll go through with all the three speakers, and at the end, depending on the time, we will take in some of them. So let us move right away to the incoming president of IEA, Danny Roderick. Danny is a Ford Foundation professor of international political economy at Harvard. Before that, he was at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and he's one of the most prominent economists and one of the most progressive voices in the world. He did his PhD from Princeton University. He has numerous books. I'll recommend two to you because time is short. The Globalization Paradox, that's one. Straight Talk on Trade, Ideas for a Sane World Economy. But let me not take any more time on introduction. Danny, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kaushik. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be part of this panel. Let me begin by thanking first our virtual host and co-sponsor, the Indonesian government, and the Minister of Finance, Sri Mulyani. Thank you very much for making this this possible. Time is short, so I think I will just say a few words about the global context as I see it, and where we might be headed. I think the most important and interesting thing that I see is a kind of a transition for which the pandemic seems to be a turning point, although the transition itself is not because of the pandemic, but the pandemic makes the transition, I think, much more obvious and transparent and easier to see. But the transition that I see is from roughly a quarter century of convergence in the world in terms of economic performance, with developing countries, for the most part, actually doing extremely well. Of course, East and Southeast Asia has been doing well for quite some time, but that this became a much more broadly shared feature of Asia, including South Asia, and spread to sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America as well, which have had, prior to the pandemic for a decade or two, we're really having some of the best periods of economic growth in quite a long time, so that we were really having convergence in economic performance. And there was a certain amount of convergence in thinking about economic policy and sort of what good technocratic economic policy might be, if I can use the term technocracy, so technocratic economic policy that I heard Sri Mulyani refer to. Now, I think this period of convergence, as I see it, the one that we might be going into, looks to me like it's going to be much more a period of divergence. And I think there are certain risks as well as some opportunities there.